I will tell you the story of a golden sun that rose in the north to eclipse the fading light of a weak king. It is a tale of brothers turned executioners, of a kingmaker who found himself without a crown, and of a white rose that grew red with the blood of its own kin. Why did a simple secret marriage to a common widow ignite a fire that burnt down a dynasty? How did the most powerful noble in the realm become the greatest traitor to the man he put on the throne? What was the witchcraft accused of a queen to explain a king's obsession? How did a thick, blinding mist on a battlefield lead a father to kill his own son by mistake? What was the pre-contract that turned royal princes into illegitimate prisoners in a lonely tower? Where did the two young princes vanish, and what secrets are buried beneath the stones of the Tower of London? How did a man who lost everything in exile return with a ragtag army to fulfill an ancient prophecy? Why did the Kingmaker die alone in a muddy field, betrayed by the very winds of fate? What made a king charge headlong into his enemies, choosing a manful death over a shameful retreat? How did a kitchen boy who claimed to be a king end up turning spits for his conqueror? And how did two warring houses finally entwine their stems to create a rose that would rule for a century of gold? It is the saga of the crown that was lost and won in the mud of England, a 30-year storm of steel and ambition that ended the Middle Ages and gave birth to a global empire. The struggle for the throne, the War of the Cousins, the Wars of the Roses. In the year 1455, the world stood at a crossroads between the dying Middle Ages and the birth of the Renaissance. Europe was a patchwork of kingdoms still reeling from the exhaustion of the 100 Years' War. To the south, the great city of Constantinople had recently fallen to the Ottoman Turks, shaking the foundations of the Christian world. In France, King Charles VII, known as the Victorious, was finally consolidating his power after decades of conflict with the English. The Holy Roman Empire was ruled by Frederick III, a man who preferred cautious diplomacy to the fire of the battlefield. Across the northern border of England, the stubborn and fierce King James II governed Scotland with an eye on his southern neighbors' growing instability. But in England itself, a thick cloud of uncertainty hung over the throne of Westminster. The country was ruled by King Henry VI, a gentle and deeply religious man who lacked the iron will of his father. His mind was often clouded by bouts of mental illness, leaving the governance of the realm to his ambitious and strong-willed wife, Margaret of Anjou. As the king's grip on power weakened, the great noble families of the land began to look at one another with suspicion and greed. Two mighty branches of the royal Plantagenet family, the House of Lancaster and the House of York, stood ready to claim the crown. This was the dawn of a 30-year struggle of blood, betrayal, and shifting loyalties that history would come to call the Wars of the Roses. The red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York were about to be drenched in the blood of an entire generation. Prepare yourself, for the story of the Cousins' War is about to begin. The title, Wars of the Roses, finds its roots in the heraldic badges representing two rival branches of the royal house of Plantagenet. These factions, the White Rose of York and the Red Rose of Lancaster, were locked in a bitter struggle for the English throne. Early variations of this name appeared in 1727, when Bevel Higgins described the quarrel between the two roses. Historian David Hume later noted in the History of England that the populace chose these symbols to show their divided affections. Hume explained that Lancastrian partisans took the red rose as their mark, while those of York were identified by the white. Consequently, these internal conflicts became known across Europe as the quarrel between the two roses. The specific modern term, Wars of the Roses, only entered common usage in the early 19th century. Its popularity followed the 1829 publication of the novel Anne of Gerstein by Sir Walter Scott. Scott drew inspiration from a famous scene in William Shakespeare's play, Henry VI, Part 1. This scene, set in the Temple Church gardens, depicts noblemen picking roses to symbolize their loyalty to either the Yorkist or Lancastrian cause. During the actual era of the conflict, people simply referred to the struggle as the Civil Wars. While the Yorkist faction adopted the white rose early on, the red rose was not used by Lancastrians until Henry Tudor's victory in 1485. Following the Battle of Bosworth Field, Henry Tudor married Elizabeth of York, the heir of Edward IV. This marriage merged the two symbols into the Tudor rose, signifying the peaceful union of the rival claims. The tradition of using a rose as a royal emblem actually began with Edward I, who used a golden rose on a stalk. Nobles often displayed multiple badges depending on the many titles they held simultaneously. For instance, Edward IV utilized the sun in splendor from his earldom and the falcon and fetterlock from his dukedom. These badges could sometimes cause deadly misunderstandings on the battlefield due to their visual similarities. At the Battle of Barnet, the Yorkist sun was mistaken for the Earl of Oxford's star, leading to tragic confusion in the heat of combat. Soldiers typically wore livery badges to show their allegiance to their specific liege lords or wealthy patrons. However, these badges were reserved for those in permanent service, meaning mercenary groups did not wear them. At the decisive Battle of Bosworth, Henry Tudor's troops fought under the banner of a fierce red dragon. In contrast, the Yorkist army followed the personal device of King Richard III, which was a white boar. Interestingly, the names of these rival houses had very little to do with the actual cities of York and Lancaster. The lands belonging to the Duchy of Lancaster were mostly situated in Gloucestershire, North Wales, Cheshire, and Yorkshire. Similarly, the vast estates of the Duke of York were scattered across England and the Welsh Marsh, rather than being centered in the city of York. Historians continue to debate the primary factors that triggered the outbreak of these wars. A major root cause was the family structure of Edward III, who ruled England from 1327 to 1377. Edward had 5 sons who survived into adulthood: Edward the Black Prince, Lionel of Antwerp, John of Gaunt, Edmund of Langley, and Thomas of Woodstock. To provide for them, he established several duchies, starting with Cornwall in 1337 for his eldest son, Edward. In 1362, he created the Duchy of Clarence for Lionel and the Duchy of Lancaster for John. Later, in 1385, under Richard II, Edmund was named Duke of York, and Thomas became the Duke of Gloucester. Before 1337, no English monarch had ever granted the title of Duke to a subject. The creation of these duchies birthed a powerful new class of nobility, with direct claims to the English throne. These dukes possessed enough wealth and influence to challenge the crown because their income was independent of the state. This financial freedom allowed Edward's sons and their heirs to maintain their own private military forces. These duchies worsened the flaws of bastard feudalism, a term coined in 1885 by Charles Plummer and defined by William Stubbs. Under Edward I, the social structure had shifted from traditional feudal levies to a system of royal payments for military service. Instead of vassals serving simply because they held land, they paid fees to their lords, who then hired professional soldiers. These groups of hired retainers were known as affinities, a core element of the bastard feudal system. These affinities tied the high-ranking magnates to the lower nobility through personal connections and mutual benefits. Unlike the old feudal system, these new relationships were based on personal loyalty and profit, rather than land tenure. Consequently, lords could command retinues they trusted completely, as these men owed their status to their patron. These networks grew massive, as members of an affinity would support one another, even if they did not know the lord personally. During the reign of Richard II, a power struggle erupted because the king tried to build his own affinity to counter his nobles. The retinues of the magnates eventually became strong enough to defy the authority of the monarch himself. John of Gaunt and his son, Henry Bolingbroke, famously used this power to challenge and eventually overthrow Richard II. When the Wars of the Roses began, leaders like Richard of York and Warwick the Kingmaker relied on these networks to defy Henry VI. The House of Lancaster traced its lineage back to John of Gaunt, the third surviving son of King Edward III. The name of the house was taken from Gaunt's title as the Duke of Lancaster, which he acquired through his marriage to Blanche of Lancaster. King Edward III had originally favored the Lancastrian claim by explicitly emphasizing the male line of descent for the throne. Henry IV used this specific legal preference to justify deposing Richard II and seizing the crown for himself. At that time, a competing claim existed through Edmund Mortimer, the great-grandson of Edward III's second son, Lionel of Antwerp. However, because Mortimer's claim came through his grandmother, Philippa, it was a female line of descent which was considered weaker by some. A notable branch of the Lancastrian family was the House of Beaufort, born from the relationship between John of Gaunt and his mistress, Catherine Swynford. Although they were eventually legitimized by an act of Parliament after their parents married, Henry IV barred the Beauforts from the line of succession. The House of York was founded by Edmund of Langley, the fourth surviving son of Edward III and the younger brother of John of Gaunt. The family name came from the Dukedom of York, a title Edmund received in 1385 during the reign of his nephew, Richard II. In contrast to the Lancastrians, the Yorkist claim to the throne relied on the female line of descent from the older brother, Lionel of Antwerp. This claim was solidified when Edmund's son, Richard of Conisburg, married Anne de Mortimer. Anne was the sister of Edmund Mortimer and the granddaughter of Philippa of Clarence, the daughter of the Duke of Clarence. During the 14th century, the Mortimer family reigned as the most powerful and influential lords in the Welsh marshes. Historian G. M. Trevelyan noted that the Wars of the Roses were largely a conflict between these great Welsh marcher lords who were also English royalty. These noble families were so closely related to the throne that their personal quarrels became a national crisis for England. Historian Ian Mortimer argues that the root cause of the Wars of the Roses was the succession crisis following the death of Edward III in 1377. Although the royal line initially seemed secure, there was a sudden and problematic narrowing of the direct descent near the end of his reign. Edward's two eldest sons, the Black Prince and Lionel of Antwerp, had both died before their father in 1376 and 1368. This left Edward III with 3 surviving sons: John of Gaunt, Edmund of Langley, and Thomas of Woodstock. The Black Prince had 1 surviving son named Richard, who held a claim based on the principle that the son of the heir apparent takes priority over his uncles. Consequently, young Richard possessed a legally superior claim compared to his much older and more experienced uncles. However, Richard was a minor without siblings, while his 3 uncles were politically powerful and highly ambitious men. This dynamic created significant uncertainty throughout the kingdom regarding who should truly inherit the crown. Ultimately, the crown passed to the grandson, who was coronated as Richard II at the tender age of 10. According to the laws of primogeniture, if Richard died without an heir, the throne should pass to the descendants of the second son, Lionel of Antwerp. Lionel's daughter, Philippa, had married into the Mortimer family, making her son Roger Mortimer the individual with the strongest legal claim. Yet a legal decree issued by Edward III in 1376 added a layer of complexity to this already fragile situation. Through letters patent, Edward III limited the succession to his male line, which effectively pushed John of Gaunt ahead of the Mortimer family. This move prioritized the 3rd son over the descendants of the second son simply because the latter's claim came through a woman. Richard II, also known as Richard of Bordeaux, reigned as King of England from 1377 until his deposition in 1399. During his early years, the government was managed by regency councils heavily influenced by his uncles, John of Gaunt and Thomas of Woodstock. The kingdom faced immense pressure at this time, most notably from the ongoing exhaustion of the 100 Years' War. A massive challenge arose in 1381 with the Peasants' Revolt, where the young king played a central role in successfully crushing the uprising. Richard was notably less interested in warfare than his father or grandfather, and actively sought to end the conflict with France. As a staunch believer in royal prerogative, Richard tried to curb the power of the aristocracy by relying on a private military retinue. He transformed the court into a refined center of art and culture, positioning himself as an elevated and almost sacred figure. Despite these cultural pursuits, his reign was incredibly turbulent and marked by constant friction with his most powerful nobles. Richard chose to rule without a regency council as soon as possible to prevent John of Gaunt from exercising legitimate power. Unpopular taxes used to fund failed military campaigns in Europe eventually triggered the 1381 revolt. A political crisis emerged when Parliament refused to cooperate with Richard's chancellor, Michael de la Pole, nearly resulting in the king's dethronement. To keep his enemies off balance, Richard frequently changed his mind about who he would designate as his official heir. His heavy reliance on a small circle of favorites angered the nobility, leading a group called the Lords Appellant to seize control of the government in 1387. By 1389, Richard managed to regain his authority and spent the next 8 years in a fragile peace with his former rivals. During this time, much of the French territory conquered by his grandfather had been lost to the enemy. Richard attempted to negotiate the Truce of Lullingham with Charles VI, but the proposal was so submissive it was rejected by Parliament. Bypassing Parliament entirely, Richard negotiated a de facto peace by agreeing to marry Charles's 6-year-old daughter, Isabella of Valois. He used this period of temporary peace to finally strike back at his political enemies with ruthless efficiency. In 1397 he took vengeance on the Lords Appellate, resulting in many of them being executed or forced into exile. The final 2 years of his rule are described by historians as a period of Richard's tyranny, which set the stage for his downfall. Upon the death of John of Gaunt in 1399, Richard seized the vast lands and titles belonging to Gaunt's son, Henry Bolingbroke. Bolingbroke had already been living in exile in France since the previous year following a dispute with the king. In May 1399, Richard departed England to lead a military campaign in Ireland, leaving the kingdom vulnerable. Seeing his chance, Bolingbroke returned to England in June 1399 with a modest force that swelled rapidly as he marched. He met very little resistance as he moved through the country, gaining the support of a nobility tired of Richard's rule. With the backing of the disaffected lords, Bolingbroke deposed Richard and was crowned King Henry IV, the first monarch of the House of Lancaster. Richard was imprisoned and is widely believed to have been starved to death in captivity, though the exact details of his end remain a mystery. The posthumous reputation of Richard II was largely defined by William Shakespeare's famous play. In the drama, Shakespeare portrays Richard's poor leadership and eventual removal as the direct catalyst for the Wars of the Roses. Modern historians generally reject the idea that his fall was the sole cause of the later wars, though they do not excuse his failures. While scholars no longer believe he was insane, some suggest he may have suffered from a personality disorder that intensified toward the end of his reign. Most experts agree that while his political goals were not entirely radical, the aggressive way he pursued them was intolerable to the ruling class. This fundamental breakdown in the relationship between the king and the political establishment ultimately ensured his downfall. Almost immediately after taking the throne, Henry IV faced a conspiracy known as the Epiphany Rising in 1400. This attempt to restore the imprisoned Richard II was led by the Earl of Salisbury, the Dukes of Exeter and Surrey, and the Earl of Gloucester. The rebellion failed, resulting in the execution of all 4 leaders, and Richard died shortly thereafter at Pontefract Castle under mysterious circumstances. In Wales, where Richard had been popular, the accession of Henry IV sparked a massive revolt led by the nobleman Owain Glenpur. This Welsh rebellion was fueled by various socio-economic grievances and lasted until 1415, outliving Henry IV's own reign. During the conflict, Glenpur was supported by the Tudors of Anglesey, a prominent family that would later play a central role in the Wars of the Roses. Henry IV also faced multiple rebellions from the powerful House of Percy, led by the Earls of Northumberland and Worcester. The Percys, once allies of Henry, turned against him after disputes over money, land, and royal favor. Their first challenge ended in defeat at the Battle of Shrewsbury in 1403, where Worcester was executed. A second Percy uprising failed at Bramham Moor in 1408, a battle in which the Earl of Northumberland was killed. Henry IV died in 1413 and was succeeded by his son, Henry of Monmouth, who was crowned as King Henry V. To solidify his legitimacy at home and abroad, Henry V revived ancient English claims to the throne of France. He used French support for Glenpur and various commercial disputes as a reason to launch an invasion of France in 1415. Just before his departure, Henry V crushed the Southampton plot, a conspiracy to replace him with Edmund Mortimer. The plot was led by Sir Thomas Grey, Baron Scrope, and Richard of Königsberg, the son of the Duke of York. Mortimer remained loyal to the king and revealed the plan, leading to the execution of the three primary conspirators. Henry V captured Harfleur in September and went on to win a stunning victory at the Battle of Agincourt in October 1415. This victory decimated the French nobility and firmly established the legitimacy of the Lancastrian dynasty in the eyes of Europe. In 1420, the Treaty of Troyes was signed, which disinherited the French Dauphin and named Henry V as the heir to the French King Charles VI. As part of the agreement, Henry V married Catherine of Valois, ensuring their future children would inherit both the English and French crowns. Meanwhile, Richard of York, the son of the executed Richard of Königsberg, was allowed to inherit the Duchy of York. He received this title after his uncle Edward died at Agincourt, without leaving any children of his own. When Edmund Mortimer died childless in 1425, Richard of York also inherited the earldom of March and the Mortimer claim to the throne. Henry V felt the Lancastrian succession was secure, as he had three younger brothers and a newborn son named Henry. However, Henry V died of dysentery in 1422, leaving his 9-month-old son to ascend the throne as Henry VI. The younger brothers of Henry V failed to produce legitimate heirs, leaving only the Beaufort family as potential Lancastrian successors. As Henry VI grew into a weak and ineffective ruler, Richard of York's claim to the throne became increasingly appealing to many. Furthermore, the massive income from his vast estates made Richard of York the wealthiest and most powerful noble in the entire kingdom. From his early childhood, Henry VI was trapped in the middle of a rivalry between his quarrelsome advisers. His younger uncle, Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, wanted to be named Lord Protector and frequently sought the support of the common people. Gloucester was constantly opposed by his half-uncle, Cardinal Henry Beaufort, a man of immense wealth and political power. On many occasions, Beaufort had to call the king's older uncle, John, Duke of Bedford, back from France to mediate these intense disputes. While the English nobles argued at home, the French rallied around Joan of Arc and handed the English major defeats at Orleans and Patay. These losses reversed the great gains made by Henry V and allowed the French Dauphin to be crowned as Charles VII at Reims. In response to the French coronation, the 7-year-old Henry VI was formally crowned King of England on November 6, 1429. During this period, Henry's mother, Catherine of Valois, secretly married a Welshman named Tudor. They had 2 sons, Edmund and Jasper Tudor, both of whom would later play vital roles in the final stages of the upcoming wars. Henry VI officially came of age in 1437 at 16, but the death of his uncle Bedford had already weakened the government. Cardinal Beaufort eventually retired from public life, leaving his ally, William de la Pole, the Earl of Suffolk, as the most powerful man at court. Suffolk and the king both preferred a peaceful, diplomatic solution to the war in France, as Henry was naturally a gentle man who hated violence. However, Gloucester and Richard of York strongly opposed this peace policy, believing that the war in France must be won by force. The king favored the peaceful faction and gave the Beauforts and Suffolk massive amounts of land, money, and high-ranking offices. This favoritism diverted essential resources away from Richard of York's military campaigns, causing him to feel a deep and bitter resentment. Suffolk's influence peaked when he organized the Treaty of Tours in 1444 to secure a peace between England and France. He arranged for Henry to marry Margaret of Anjou in exchange for surrendering the strategically vital lands of Maine and Anjou to the French. Although Suffolk was promoted to duke for his efforts, the public was so outraged by the loss of territory that the terms were kept secret. In 1447, Suffolk moved against his enemies by having the Duke of Gloucester arrested for treason. Gloucester died while awaiting trial, leading many people to suspect that Suffolk had arranged for him to be poisoned. Richard of York was then stripped of his high command in France and sent away to govern Ireland for 10 years to keep him away from the court. Despite the peace efforts, English forces continued to suffer devastating losses in France, and the public blamed Suffolk for the failure. By 1450, Suffolk was arrested and impeached, but Henry intervened to change his sentence to 5 years of exile. While traveling to France, Suffolk's ship was intercepted, and he was executed by his enemies on May 2, 1450. Edmund Beaufort, the Duke of Somerset, took Suffolk's place as the leader of the peace faction and the king's chief adviser. Somerset's position was very weak because he had overseen the disastrous military failures in France since 1448. He became a very close ally of Queen Margaret of Anjou, who exercised almost total control over her husband, King Henry. Margaret's friendship with Somerset was so close that many people across the kingdom suspected they were having a secret affair. When Margaret gave birth to a son, Edward of Westminster, in 1453, rumors spread that Somerset, not the king, was the real father. On April 10, 1450, the English suffered a devastating defeat at Formigny, which opened the door for the French to reconquer Normandy. That same year, a violent popular uprising erupted in Kent, which many historians view as a clear precursor to the Wars of the Roses. The rebel leader, Jack Cade, produced a manifesto titled "The Complaint of the Poor Commons of Kent," accusing the crown of extortion and justice perversion. The rebels successfully occupied parts of London and executed the deeply unpopular Lord High Treasurer, James Fiennes. Although the rebels dispersed after receiving a supposed pardon, several leaders, including Cade himself, were later executed. The grievances raised by Cade's followers became the foundation for Richard of York's opposition to a government that excluded him. Taking advantage of the chaos, Richard returned from Ireland to London, styling himself as a reformer demanding better governance. However, his political maneuvers failed at this stage, and he was imprisoned for much of 1452 and 1453. By the summer of 1453, it appeared that Richard of York had completely lost his power struggle against the court faction. Throughout these intense political quarrels, King Henry VI had remained largely passive and uninvolved. He displayed symptoms of a mental illness that he likely inherited from his maternal grandfather, King Charles VI of France. Henry's lack of military leadership left English forces in France weak and disorganized, contributing to their defeat at Formigny. The king was far more interested in religion and education than in the grim realities of governing or warfare. His timid nature and aversion to conflict made him an entirely ineffectual monarch for such a violent and unstable era. On July 17, 1453, the English suffered a final, catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Castillon. This loss stripped England of all its French territories except for the Pale of Calais, and officially ended the 100 Years' War. Upon hearing this news, Henry VI suffered a total mental collapse, reaching a state where he could not even recognize his newborn son, Edward. When the Lord Chancellor died in March 1454, the king was unable to name a successor, making the government constitutionally unable to function. With no central authority, the political situation worsened as powerful noble families, like the Percys and Nevilles, engaged in violent feuds. To prevent total collapse, a regency council was formed, and Richard of York was appointed Lord Protector on March 27, 1454. York immediately appointed his brother-in-law, the Earl of Salisbury, as Chancellor to counter the influence of the Earl of Northumberland. By supporting the Neville family, York gained a massive ally in Salisbury's son, Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick. York then removed his rival Somerset from power and had him imprisoned within the Tower of London. In 1455, Henry VI made a sudden and unexpected recovery, which immediately reversed the progress Richard of York had made. Somerset was released and restored to the king's favor, while York was stripped of his authority and forced into exile. However, the Earls of Warwick and Salisbury remained loyal to York, backing his claim to control the government. Henry and Somerset planned to hold a great council in Leicester on May 22nd, away from their enemies in London. Fearing they would be charged with treason at this council, York and his allies raised an army to intercept the royal party. They met at St. Albans, intending to stop the king and Somerset before they could reach the safety of the council. Richard of York led a force of between 3,000 and 7,000 troops south toward London to confront the king. They were met at St. Albans on the 22nd of May 1455 by Henry's smaller force of 2,000 men. Although the battle resulted in fewer than 160 total casualties, it was a decisive victory for the Yorkist cause. King Henry VI was taken prisoner after York's men found him hiding in a local tanner's shop, deserted by his advisers. The battle was significant because many of York's most powerful enemies were killed in the fighting. Among the dead were Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, the Earl of Northumberland, and Baron de Clifford. With the king in his custody and his rivals removed, York was once again appointed Lord Protector by Parliament. This victory allowed the Yorkist faction to regain their former position of immense influence over the government. York's allies flourished, especially the young Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, who was serving as the captain of Calais. Warwick gained fame by conducting successful anti-piracy operations in the English Channel, boosting his popularity. He soon surpassed his father, the Earl of Salisbury, as York's most vital ally and protector within Parliament. As commander of Calais, Warwick held the keys to England's largest and most professional standing army. Queen Margaret of Anjou viewed Warwick as a dangerous threat and tried to weaken him by cutting off his military supplies. However, a French raid on Sandwich in 1457 created such fear of an invasion that she was forced to restore his funding. In February 1456, Henry recovered his mental health and once again stripped York of his title as Lord Protector. The king reassumed personal control of the realm, but the peace between the rival houses remained incredibly fragile. Lawlessness returned to the kingdom as violent clashes between the Neville and Percy families broke out once more. In a desperate attempt to end the feud, Henry organized a Love-Day reconciliation at St. Paul's Cathedral in 1458. The rivals walked hand in hand in a public procession, but as soon as it ended, the secret plotting for war began again. While Henry attempted to secure a lasting peace, Warwick ignored the king's authority by attacking the Castilian and Hanseatic fleets in 1458. His command in Calais allowed him to build powerful international ties with Charles VII of France and Philip the Good of Burgundy. When the king summoned Warwick, York, and Salisbury to London to explain these raids, they refused for fear of being arrested. York instead called his allies to meet at Ludlow Castle, and Warwick arrived from Calais with a portion of the town's professional garrison. During this time, Queen Margaret was busy recruiting her own army, giving her supporters a silver swan as their livery emblem. On the 23rd of September 1459, a Yorkist force under Salisbury was ambushed at Bloor Heath by a Lancastrian army twice its size. Despite being outnumbered, the Yorkists won the battle and killed the Lancastrian commander Baron Audley. Warwick eventually joined the main force at Ludford Bridge, but the Yorkist army was ruined when their professional troops defected to the king. Following this collapse, York and his son Edmund fled to Ireland, while Warwick, Salisbury, and the young Edward of March sailed to Calais. The Lancastrians tried to replace Warwick with Henry Beaufort as commander of Calais, but the soldiers there remained loyal to the Yorkists. The victorious Lancastrians then held a Parliament of Devils to legally seize the lands and titles of the Yorkist leaders. This harsh legal action backfired, as it terrified other noblemen who feared their own property might be taken next. In March 1460, Warwick managed to sail to Ireland to plan a new strategy with York, successfully evading the royal fleet. By late June, Warwick and Edward of March landed in England and marched to London, where they were welcomed by the citizens. While Salisbury stayed behind to besiege the Tower of London, Warwick and Edward led their army north to find King Henry. The two sides clashed at the Battle of Northampton on the 10th of July 1460, where the Yorkists achieved another major victory. Several great lords, including the Duke of Buckingham and the Earl of Shrewsbury, died while trying to protect the king. For the second time, King Henry VI was captured by the Yorkists and brought back to London as a prisoner. In September, Richard of York returned from Ireland and shocked Parliament by laying his hand on the throne to claim it as his own. Even his most loyal allies were not yet ready to support the complete removal of King Henry from power. The judges of the realm refused to rule on the matter, stating that the royal succession was a subject far above the common law. Eventually, a compromise known as the Act of Accord was signed, naming York as the heir to the throne instead of Henry's own son. This agreement failed to bring peace, as the disinherited prince's supporters immediately prepared to resume the war. Queen Margaret and her young son fled to the safety of Harlech Castle, a strong Lancastrian fortress in Wales. There, they joined forces with Henry's half-brother Jasper Tudor and the Duke of Exeter, who were already gathering troops. Margaret then traveled north to Scotland to seek further military assistance from the Queen Regent Mary of Guelders. In exchange for Scottish soldiers, Margaret agreed to surrender the strategic town of Berwick to the Scottish crown. This happened shortly after King James II of Scotland had died, while successfully trying to reclaim Roxburgh during the English turmoil. The Queen also successfully negotiated for French aid by promising to hand over the island of Jersey to France. By securing the support of the Auld Alliance, Margaret ensured that both France and Scotland would help prevent a Yorkist-Burgundian alliance. Meanwhile, the Lancastrian cause gained massive momentum in northern England, where the Percy family rallied their supporters. The Duke of Somerset and the Earl of Devon arrived in the north to bolster this growing Lancastrian army. Recognizing the danger, Richard of York, his son Rutland, and the Earl of Salisbury marched north from London to confront the threat. On the 16th of December 1460, York's advance guard was defeated by Somerset's troops during a clash at the Battle of Worksop. By the 21st of December, York reached the safety of Sandal Castle near Wakefield, while the Lancastrian army camped only 9 miles away. For reasons that remain a mystery to historians, York decided to leave the safety of his castle walls on the 30th of December. In the disastrous Battle of Wakefield that followed, Richard of York, his son Rutland, and Thomas Neville were all killed on the field. The Earl of Salisbury was captured by the Lancastrians the following night and was immediately executed. The heads of the fallen Yorkist leaders were later mockingly displayed on the gates of York, with Richard's head wearing a paper crown. After the Yorkist defeat at Wakefield, Richard's 18-year-old son, Edward, Earl of March, became the new heir to the Dukedom of York. By inheriting his father's titles, Edward also took up the Yorkist claim to the English throne. Edward immediately moved to block the Lancastrian forces gathering in the west and Wales from joining the main army in the north. On the 2nd of February 1461, he achieved a decisive victory over the Lancastrian armies at the Battle of Mortimer's Cross. Following the battle, his troops captured and executed Owen Tudor, the husband of Henry V's widow, Catherine of Valois. At dawn before the fighting began, a rare meteorological event called a parhelion caused 3 suns to appear in the sky. Edward calmed his terrified soldiers by telling them the 3 suns represented the Holy Trinity and signaled divine favor for their cause. This event inspired Edward to adopt the sun in splendor as his own personal heraldic emblem. In the north, Queen Margaret's victorious army began a march toward London to reclaim the capital. Warwick, still holding King Henry as a prisoner, positioned his forces along Watling Street at St. Albans to intercept her. Despite being well entrenched, Warwick's forces were defeated by the Lancastrians in the Second Battle of St. Albans on the 17th of February. King Henry was liberated by his wife's army and knighted his young son, Prince Edward of Westminster, on the field. Warwick managed to escape the defeat and marched quickly to join forces with Edward, who was fresh from his win at Mortimer's Cross. Although the Lancastrians held the military advantage, the people of London feared Margaret's army and refused to let them enter the city. Seizing this opportunity, Edward and Warwick raced to London, where a quickly gathered assembly proclaimed the young man King Edward IV. Edward was a far more appealing leader to the public than Henry, as he was seen as energetic, handsome, and affable. His supporters intentionally presented him in resplendent armor and fine clothing to contrast his strength with Henry's mental and physical frailty. To secure his new crown, Edward and Warwick marched north to confront the main Lancastrian power. Warwick led the vanguard into a fierce but inconclusive clash at Ferrybridge on the 28th of March, where he was wounded in the fighting. During that engagement, the Lancastrian commanders Baron Clifford and Baron Neville were both killed. On the following day, the 29th of March, the 2 main armies met near the village of Towton in Yorkshire during a blinding snowstorm. The Battle of Towton became the largest and bloodiest conflict ever fought on English soil. The result was a total Yorkist triumph, that effectively shattered Lancastrian power in the north of England. The pillars of the Lancastrian court were destroyed, with the Earl of Northumberland and the commander Andrew Trollope killed in action. The Earl of Ormond was captured and executed, while Henry, Margaret, and Prince Edward were forced to flee into exile in Scotland. Edward IV returned to London for his formal coronation, leaving Warwick in the north to suppress any remaining resistance. The victory at Towton confirmed to the nation that Edward was the undisputed ruler of England for the foreseeable future. Edward used his newfound authority to pass a bill of attainder, stripping 14 Lancastrian peers and 96 knights of their titles and lands. Edward was formally crowned King of England on the 28th of June 1461, during a grand ceremony at Westminster Abbey. Following his coronation, Edward made a strategic effort to win the loyalty of his former enemies. He issued pardons to many Lancastrians who had been stripped of their status after the Battle of Towton. As long as they submitted to his rule, Edward allowed these nobles to keep their titles and their ancestral property. Warwick received immense rewards from Edward's patronage, making him the most powerful nobleman in the kingdom. In addition to inheriting the vast lands of both his parents, Warwick was appointed High Admiral of England. He was also named Steward of the Duchy of Lancaster and held several other positions of great national importance. During the summer of 1462, Warwick successfully negotiated a diplomatic truce with the Kingdom of Scotland. Meanwhile, in Ireland, Yorkist forces under the Earl of Desmond achieved a decisive victory at the Battle of Piltown. This defeat forced the Lancastrian Earl of Ormond into exile and ended all Lancastrian hopes for control in Ireland. In October, Margaret of Anjou launched an invasion with French troops and seized the castles of Alnwick and Bamberg. However, the Yorkist forces moved quickly and managed to recapture both fortresses within just 3 months. The north of England rose in revolt again in early 1463 when Sir Ralph Percy laid siege to Norham Castle. By late 1463, Warwick had secured new truces with both France and Scotland, isolating the northern rebels. This diplomatic success allowed Warwick to reclaim much of the lost territory in the north by the following year. The main Lancastrian army attempted to march south, but was intercepted and destroyed by John Neville at the Battle of Hexham. On the 15th of May 1464, the Yorkists captured and executed the Duke of Somerset along with Barons Ross and Hungerford. Yorkist troops eventually discovered the deposed King Henry hiding in the woods near the River Ribble. Henry was taken to London as a prisoner and confined within the walls of the Tower of London. With the Lancastrian army defeated and the former king in custody, all effective resistance to Edward's rule was eliminated. Edward decided it was better to keep the frail Henry alive as a captive, rather than kill him while his son remained free. Margaret and Prince Edward were forced to flee Scotland, and sailed for the court of King Louis XI of France. There, the Lancastrian royal family lived in an impoverished court in exile for several years. With his position on the throne secure, Edward was finally free to pursue his own domestic and foreign goals. Internationally, the king favored a strategic alliance with the Duchy of Burgundy to strengthen England's position. However, Warwick pushed him to negotiate with Louis XI of France, suggesting a marriage between Edward and a French princess. Warwick proposed either Bona of Savoy, the king's sister-in-law, or Anne of France as a suitable bride for the English monarch. In October 1464, Warwick discovered to his absolute rage that Edward had already been married for 4 months. On the 1st of May, Edward had secretly wed Elizabeth Woodville, who was the widow of a fallen Lancastrian nobleman. Elizabeth had 12 siblings who began marrying into prominent families, creating a new political power base outside of Warwick's control. This secret marriage proved to the world that Warwick was not the true power behind the throne, as many had previously assumed. The king's privy council criticized the match, believing that marrying a woman of such low noble rank was unworthy of a king. In a desperate attempt to regain his influence, Warwick accused Elizabeth and her mother, Jacquetta, of using witchcraft to ensnare the king. This accusation failed to gain traction, and although it strained the relationship between Warwick and Edward, it did not yet break it. Edward's choice of a bride would continue to haunt him politically for the remainder of his time as king. The marriage made it appear as though Warwick had been intentionally deceiving the French during their high-level negotiations. Meanwhile, the Woodville family began to ascend to the highest offices of the land with the king's enthusiastic support. The Queen's father, Earl Rivers, was appointed Lord High Treasurer and actively encouraged the king to align with Burgundy. Without telling Warwick, Edward signed a secret treaty with Burgundy in October 1467, while letting Warwick continue useless talks with France. In 1467, Edward further insulted Warwick by removing his brother, the Archbishop of York, from the position of Lord Chancellor. The king also refused to allow a marriage between Warwick's daughter, Isabel, and his own brother, George, Duke of Clarence. Clarence deeply resented this interference, as he felt his brother was blocking his own path to power and wealth. In 1468, Edward successfully retook the island of Jersey from the French, further asserting his military authority. In April 1469, a major rebellion erupted in Yorkshire, under a mysterious leader known as Robin of Ridsdale. A second pro-Lancastrian revolt followed a month later, demanding that Henry Percy be restored as the Earl of Northumberland. Although John Neville crushed the second revolt, he notably made very little effort to stop the actions of the Ridsdale rebels. Warwick and Clarence spent the summer gathering troops under the pretense of supporting the king against these uprisings. In early July, they traveled to Calais, where Clarence and Warwick's daughter, Isabel, were married in defiance of Edward's wishes. They returned to England and marched north to join the Yorkshire rebels, claiming they only wanted to remove the king's evil counselors. In reality, Warwick secretly planned to depose Edward and place the 19-year-old Clarence on the throne in his stead. On the 26th of July 1469, the Ridsdale rebels defeated the royal forces at the Battle of Edgecote. The royal commanders, the Earl of Pembroke and the Earl of Devon, were both captured and executed following the defeat. The Queen's father, Lord Rivers, and her brother, Sir John Woodville, were also seized and murdered by Warwick's faction. King Edward was eventually taken prisoner by George Neville and held captive at Middleham Castle. However, Warwick and Clarence soon realized they lacked the broad political support necessary to rule the country without him. With lawlessness spreading and the nobility refusing to cooperate, Edward was released in September and resumed his royal duties. In March 1470, Warwick and Clarence tried again by inciting a rebellion in Lincolnshire to lure Edward into another trap. Edward responded with unexpected speed, routing the rebels at the Battle of Losecoat Field on the 12th of March 1470. The captured rebel leader, Baron Willoughby confessed that Warwick and Clarence were the true chief provokers of the treason. Physical evidence was also discovered that proved their guilt, forcing the two men to flee across the sea to France in May. Willoughby was beheaded for his role in the plot, and his vast estates were seized by the crown. Louis XI of France saw an opportunity in Warwick's exile and brokered a shocking peace between the Earl and his enemy, Margaret of Anjou. The goal of this unlikely alliance was to overthrow Edward IV and restore the captive Henry VI to the throne. To seal the pact, Warwick's daughter, Anne Neville, was married to Margaret's son, the heir apparent Edward of Westminster. Margaret remained cautious, however, and some believe she prevented the marriage from being consummated in case a better match appeared later. In September 1470, Warwick and Clarence launched a surprise invasion at Dartmouth and Plymouth, while a distraction was staged in the north. Warwick's brother, the Marquis of Montague, betrayed King Edward and joined the rebels because he felt unrewarded for his past loyalty. Edward rushed south to fight the invaders, but soon found himself trapped between Montague's northern army and Warwick's southern forces. Left with no other choice, Edward and his brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, fled across the sea to Flanders on the 2nd of October. This period, known as the readoption of Henry VI, saw the frail old king restored to a throne that Warwick now fully controlled. Parliament officially stripped Edward of his titles, and his brother Clarence was mockingly awarded the dukedom of York. Edward's brother-in-law, Charles the Bold of Burgundy, initially provided almost no help to the exiled king, a slight Edward deeply resented. The new Lancastrian government was doomed by internal hatred, as the Duke of Somerset still blamed Warwick for his father's death years earlier. Clarence also began to realize that a Lancastrian restoration left him with no real path to the crown, making him politically isolated. With the help of Flemish merchants, Edward eventually returned to England, landing at Ravenspurn in Yorkshire on the 14th of March 1471. As Edward's army grew, he was joined by influential knights, which finally convinced Clarence to abandon Warwick and rejoin his brother. Edward's forces moved with incredible speed to London, where they recaptured the helpless Henry VI and sent him back to the Tower. Violent storms prevented Queen Margaret's French reinforcements from crossing the Channel, leaving Warwick to face Edward alone. The two armies met at the Battle of Barnet on the 14th of April 1471, fighting in a thick, blinding mist that covered the field. Due to the poor visibility, the Lancastrians mistook the Earl of Oxford's star emblem for Edward's sun symbol, and accidentally attacked their own allies. This confusion broke the Lancastrian lines, and in the ensuing slaughter, both Warwick and his brother Montague were killed. The Duke of Exeter was captured and imprisoned, only to die mysteriously years later by falling overboard during a voyage to France. The death of Warwick, the Kingmaker, was a fatal blow to the Lancastrian cause and ended the political power of the Neville family forever. The restoration of Henry VI proved to be a fleeting victory for the Lancastrian cause. On the very day Warwick fell at Barnet, Queen Margaret finally landed her forces at Weymouth. She immediately began augmenting her army with fresh recruits from the Welsh marshes and survivors from the Barnet defeat. Edward IV moved with speed to intercept her, realizing she intended to cross the River Severn to reach the safety of Wales. Sir Richard Beauchamp, the governor of Gloucester, received word from the Yorkists and barred his city's gates against Margaret. This forced the Lancastrians into a grueling march, preventing them from crossing the river before Edward could catch them. On the 4th of May 1471, the two armies collided at the Battle of Tewkesbury, where Edward achieved a crushing and final victory. During the slaughter, Henry and Margaret's only son, Edward of Westminster, was killed by the Duke of Clarence's men. The Duke of Somerset and the Earl of Devon were also killed, effectively wiping out the Lancastrian leadership. According to the royal propaganda in the history of the arrival of Edward IV, the king's army was small but exceptionally well armed. The text claims Edward initially told the people he had returned only to reclaim his personal Duchy of York. In reality, the Yorkist force swelled to 3,000 men as Edward moved through the Midlands and the estates of Lord Hastings. While some northern lords joined him, the chronicles suggest the turnout in the north was not as large as many had expected. Edward IV made his triumphant entry into London on the 21st of May, signaling the total restoration of Yorkist power. That very night, or shortly thereafter, the captive King Henry VI died within the walls of the Tower of London. Official Yorkist reports claimed Henry died of melancholy after learning of the death of his son and the ruin of his cause. However, it is widely suspected that Edward ordered the murder of the former king now that the Lancastrian heir was dead. Margaret of Anjou was taken prisoner and held in England until King Louis XI of France paid her ransom in 1475. She spent the rest of her life in France, where she died on the 25th of August 1482, the last great champion of the original Lancastrian line. With the crushing defeats at Barnet and Tewkesbury, all armed Lancastrian resistance seemed to have finally vanished. However, the Yorkist regime began to fracture from within due to a worsening feud between Edward's brothers, Clarence and Gloucester. On the 22nd of December 1476, Clarence's wife, Isabel Neville, passed away, leaving the Duke in a state of volatile grief. Clarence accused a lady-in-waiting named Anchoret Twinehoe of murdering his wife, and subsequently had the woman killed. In 1478, Edward issued a retrospective pardon to Anchoret's grandson, signaling his disapproval of Clarence's lawless, quasi-monarchical behavior. A further rift formed when Clarence was proposed as a husband for Mary, the new Duchess of Burgundy, a match Edward strictly forbade. Angered by the king's interference, Clarence withdrew from the royal court as the relationship between the brothers soured. Meanwhile, Gloucester had married Anne Neville, the other daughter of the Countess of Warwick and co-heir to a massive fortune. A major source of conflict arose because the estates the brothers held by marriage were more secure than the lands gifted to them by the king. Clarence continued to spiral out of favor until widespread rumors of his involvement in another revolt led to his arrest. On the 18th of February 1478, the Duke of Clarence was executed at the Tower of London, allegedly by being drowned in a vat of Malmsey wine. The remainder of Edward IV's reign was relatively peaceful at home, though he remained active in foreign affairs. In 1475, he launched an invasion of France, but quickly signed the Treaty of Picquigny with Louis XI. This treaty allowed Edward to withdraw his army in exchange for a massive initial payment and a lucrative annual pension. In 1482, Edward attempted to interfere with the Scottish throne, but was eventually forced to pull his troops back to England. Despite this, the campaign was considered a success, as the English managed to permanently retake the strategic town of Berwick. By 1483, the king's health began to fail rapidly, and he fell fatally ill during the Easter season. Before he died, Edward named his brother Richard to serve as Lord Protector for his 12-year-old son and heir, Edward V. On the 9th of April 1483, King Edward IV passed away, leaving the kingdom on the brink of another succession crisis. Richard III reigned as the last king of the House of York and the final monarch of the Plantagenet dynasty, a lineage that had ruled England for over 300 years. His short and controversial reign served as a dramatic conclusion to the long-running Wars of the Roses, having served as a loyal commander in the north for his brother Edward IV. Richard was naturally named Lord Protector when the king died in 1483. However, the path to the throne took a sharp turn before the young Edward V could be crowned. A public sermon and a subsequent assembly of lords declared Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville invalid due to a supposed previous marriage contract, rendering their children illegitimate. On the 25th of June 1483, Richard was proclaimed the rightful heir and was crowned shortly thereafter, while the young Edward V and his brother Richard were moved to the Tower of London. These princes in the Tower vanished from public view by August, sparking rumors of murder that would haunt Richard's reputation for centuries. The new king's authority was quickly challenged, starting with a failed revolt in October 1483, led by his former ally, the Duke of Buckingham. The final threat arrived in August 1485, when the last major Lancastrian claimant, Henry Tudor, landed in Wales with the support of his uncle Jasper and a contingent of French troops. As Henry marched through Pembrokeshire, his army grew with soldiers who had grown weary of Yorkist rule. The two forces finally met at Bosworth Field in a clash that would decide the fate of England. Despite Richard possessing a larger force, he was fatally betrayed by the powerful Stanley family, who entered the battle on Henry's side at the most critical moment. Richard III was slain during a final desperate charge to kill Henry himself, making him the last English king to die in battle. With Richard's death, Henry Tudor ascended the throne as Henry VII, effectively bringing the Middle Ages in England to a close. During the final years of Edward IV's reign, his brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, established himself as the most formidable power in northern England. His influence was particularly concentrated in the city of York, where he enjoyed immense popularity and maintained a strong network of loyal supporters. Recognizing his brother's capability and loyalty, the dying King Edward IV named Richard as Lord Protector to serve as regent for his 12-year-old son and successor, Edward V. As the news of the king's death spread, Richard's allies, most notably the Duke of Buckingham and the influential Lord Chamberlain, William Hastings, warned him of the potential threat posed by the Woodville family. They urged Richard to gather a significant armed force before traveling to London to ensure he could secure the regency. Richard departed from Yorkshire with the intention of meeting the young king at Northampton so they could make a unified entry into the capital. Meanwhile, the Dowager Queen Elizabeth, hoping to secure her family's position, instructed her brother, Earl Rivers, to escort the new king to London with a large guard of 2,000 men. The situation reached a turning point when Richard arrived at Northampton, only to discover that the Woodvilles had already sent the king further south to Stony Stratford. Perceiving this as a maneuver to isolate him, Richard acted decisively on the 30th of April 1483. He intercepted the party and ordered the immediate arrest of Earl Rivers, the king's half-brother Richard Grey, and the chamberlain Thomas Vaughan, sending them north as prisoners to remove the Woodville influence. Following this seizure of power, Richard and the young king continued their journey to London together. Upon their arrival, the 12-year-old Edward V was moved into the Tower of London on the 19th of May 1483, which at the time was a traditional royal residence for monarchs awaiting coronation. By the following month, he was joined there by his younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, the Duke of York, as the political climate grew increasingly tense. Despite his earlier promises of safety, Richard ordered the beheading of Earl Rivers, Richard Grey, and Thomas Vaughan in June 1483. As Lord Protector, he continued to delay the coronation of young Edward V, frustrating the royal council, which was eager to end the uncertainty of a protectorate. On the 13th of June, the political tension reached a breaking point when Richard accused the popular Lord Chamberlain, Baron Hastings, of treason. In a shocking move that bypassed all legal norms, Hastings was dragged out and executed without a trial. His death was particularly controversial because Hastings had been a staunch loyalist to Edward IV's memory and represented the single greatest obstacle to Richard's ambition. The legal justification for Richard's next move came from a clergyman, believed to be the Bishop of Bath and Wells, who informed him that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was invalid. The claim was based on a supposed prior marriage contract between Edward and Lady Eleanor Butler, which technically rendered Edward V and his siblings illegitimate and barred from the succession. On 22 June, the day originally intended for the young king's coronation, a public sermon was preached at St. Paul's Cross declaring Richard as the only rightful heir. Following a staged petition from the citizenry, Richard accepted the crown and was officially coronated at Westminster Abbey on the 6th of July, 1483. By the late summer of 1483, the deposed Edward V and his brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, completely vanished from public view within the Tower of London. While their ultimate fate has remained one of history's most enduring mysteries, many contemporaries and future historians concluded they were murdered on Richard's orders to secure his hold on power. This perceived ruthlessness turned former allies into enemies. The widowed Elizabeth Woodville and the once loyal Duke of Buckingham forged a desperate alliance with Lady Margaret Beaufort to overthrow the king. Their plan centered on Margaret's son, Henry Tudor, who was living in exile as the last viable male claimant of the Lancastrian line. To broaden his appeal to Yorkist loyalists who were horrified by the disappearance of the princes, Elizabeth Woodville proposed that Henry marry her daughter, Elizabeth of York. This promise of a union between the two houses became a powerful political tool, convincing many of Edward IV's old supporters to abandon Richard in favor of a new Tudor-led conspiracy. Ever since the Yorkist victory in 1471, Henry Tudor had lived in exile at the court of Francis II, the Duke of Brittany. Henry existed in a strange limbo, treated as half-guest and half-prisoner, as the Duke viewed the young Lancastrian claimant as a valuable political bargaining chip to use when negotiating with either England or France. Despite numerous requests from the English crown to surrender him, the Duke shielded the exiles, while his treasurer, Peer Landes, actively supported Henry in hopes that a successful Tudor revolution would result in a powerful Anglo-Breton alliance. When Richard III's former ally, the Duke of Buckingham, turned against the king, the Bretons saw their opportunity and provided Henry with 40,000 gold crowns, a fleet of ships, and 15,000 troops for an invasion. However, nature intervened when a violent storm scattered the fleet, forcing Henry to abandon the crossing and return to the continent. Unaware that his primary ally was stalled at sea, Buckingham launched his planned revolt on the 18th of October 1483, raising a massive force from his Welsh estates with the intention of joining the Earl of Devon to install Henry as king. Without the support of Henry's continental army, Buckingham's rebellion lacked the strength to challenge the crown, and Richard III suppressed the uprising with ease. The Duke was quickly captured, convicted of treason, and beheaded in Salisbury on the 2nd of November 1483. In the aftermath of this failed coup, Richard moved to punish his enemies by stripping the widowed Elizabeth Woodville of all the lands and properties she had held since the reign of her late husband. Despite this harsh financial blow and the deep-seated distrust between them, the king and the Dowager Queen eventually made a public show of reconciliation for the sake of political stability. In the wake of Buckingham's failed uprising, some 500 English exiles fled to Rennes to join Henry Tudor, significantly bolstering his court in Brittany. King Richard attempted to negotiate for Henry's extradition, but the Duke of Brittany continued to shield the exile, holding him as a valuable pawn for future concessions. The situation shifted dramatically in 1484, when the Duke fell ill and his treasurer, Pierre Landais, took control. Richard offered Landais military aid against France in exchange for Henry, but the Tudor claimant managed to escape to the French court mere hours before he could be captured. King Charles VIII of France welcomed Henry warmly, providing him with the resources for an invasion to ensure Richard would not interfere with French plans to acquire Brittany. Domestic tragedy struck Richard on the 16th of March 1485, when his wife, Anne Neville, passed away, sparking damaging rumors that the king had poisoned her to marry his own niece, Elizabeth of York. These whispers deeply alienated Richard's loyal northern supporters and threatened the Tudor strategy of uniting the two houses through a marriage of their own. Realizing he had to act before his Yorkist support evaporated, Henry secured the patronage of the French regent, Anne of Beaujeu, who provided him with 2,000 professional troops. Relying on his mother, Margaret Beaufort, to coordinate support within England, Henry set sail from France on the 1st of August with a diverse force of exiles and French and Scottish mercenaries. Henry landed at Dale in Pembrokeshire, where his return to his ancestral Welsh homeland was hailed by many as the fulfillment of ancient prophecies, describing a Welsh prince who would drive the Saxons from power. As he marched toward the English border, Richard's authority in Wales crumbled. His lieutenants failed to intercept the rebels, and powerful leaders like Rhys ap Thomas defected to the Tudor cause. By mid-August, Henry's army had grown to approximately 5,000 men as he advanced on Shrewsbury. Richard, well aware of the invasion, mobilized his own superior forces, though the powerful Stanley family remained a dangerous wild card, communicating secretly with Henry while refusing to commit their troops to either side. The final confrontation of the Wars of the Roses took place on the 22nd of August 1485 at the Battle of Bosworth Field. Although Henry's forces were outnumbered, the tide turned decisively when the Stanleys finally entered the fray on the Tudor side, crushing the Yorkist flank. Richard III, refusing to flee even as his allies like the Earl of Northumberland abandoned the field, launched a desperate final charge, and was killed fighting in the thick of the enemy. Richard became the last English king to die in battle, and Henry Tudor claimed the throne by right of conquest, dating his reign to the day before the battle to legally brand his opponents as traitors. Henry VII was officially crowned at Westminster Abbey on the 30th of October 1485, marking the start of a new era for England. True to the pledge he had made while in exile, he married Elizabeth of York on the 18th of January, 1486. This union was more than a political arrangement. It was a symbolic healing of the nation's deep wounds, as their children would inherit the royal claims of both the House of Lancaster and the House of York. The marriage was notably happy and faithful, and the birth of their first son, Prince Arthur, just 8 months later, seemed to promise a stable future for the new Tudor dynasty. Despite this union, the ghost of the Plantagenets continued to haunt Henry's early reign. In 1486, he narrowly escaped a rebellion by the Stafford brothers and Viscount Lovell. When the Staffords fled to the sanctuary of an abbey, Henry took the controversial step of having them forcibly removed, arguing that sanctuary did not apply to cases of high treason, a stance the Pope eventually supported. To further secure his crown, Henry imprisoned the young Edward, Earl of Warwick, who held the strongest remaining male-line Yorkist claim within the Tower of London. The most bizarre challenge to Henry's authority came from a young boy named Lambert Simnel. A Yorkist sympathizing priest noticed the boy's resemblance to the missing princes in the Tower and began tutoring him to impersonate royalty. Eventually, the plot shifted to claiming Simnel was the Earl of Warwick, who had supposedly escaped from the Tower. The Earl of Lincoln, a nephew of Richard III, with his own royal ambitions, fled to Burgundy to gain support for the boy from his aunt, Margaret of Burgundy. The conspirators then sailed to Ireland, a traditional Yorkist stronghold, where they actually crowned the young Simnel as King Edward VI in Dublin. Determined to end the farce, Lincoln landed in Lancashire with a motley army of 2,000 German mercenaries and a large host of Irish troops. Henry VII met this threat at the Battle of Stoke Field on the 16th of June 1487. Although the rebels fought fiercely, they were no match for the better-equipped Tudor army led by the experienced Jasper Tudor and the Earl of Oxford. The Yorkist force was utterly destroyed. Lincoln was killed on the field, and the rebellion collapsed. In an act of uncharacteristic mercy, Henry pardoned young Simnel, recognizing him as a mere puppet, and gave him a job in the royal kitchens as a spit-turner. The Battle of Stoke Field is widely considered by historians to be the final military engagement of the Wars of the Roses. While pretenders and plots would continue to emerge, the sheer scale of the Tudor victory ensured that the white and red roses were finally entwined under a single crown. In 1491, a new threat to the Tudor throne emerged in the form of Perkin Warbeck, a young man who had been working for a Breton merchant. While in Cork, Ireland, he was championed by local Yorkist sympathizers who claimed he was actually Richard of Shrewsbury, the younger of the two princes in the Tower. Warbeck maintained that his life had been spared years earlier because of his young age, and he quickly became a centerpiece of international intrigue. He was publicly embraced by Margaret of York, the sister of Edward IV, who coached him in the ways of the Yorkist court and introduced him as the rightful Richard IV to the Holy Roman Emperor and other European monarchs. The deception was convincing enough that several high-ranking English nobles, including Sir William Stanley, the very man whose intervention had saved Henry VII at Bosworth, began to communicate with Warbeck. Sir Robert Clifford even visited him and wrote back to his allies, confirming the boy's identity as the lost prince. However, Henry VII's intelligence network was vast. In January 1495, he crushed the domestic conspiracy by arresting the ringleaders. While some were fined, others, including the influential William Stanley, were executed for treason, a move that sent a chilling message to the Yorkist underground. Undeterred, Warbeck sought refuge in Scotland, where King James IV welcomed him as a valuable diplomatic tool. In September 1496, James launched an invasion of northern England with Warbeck at his side, but the campaign collapsed when expected Yorkist support failed to appear and supplies ran low. Now losing favor with the Scots, Warbeck made a final, desperate gamble by landing in Cornwall in 1497. He hoped to exploit the local fury over Henry's heavy taxes, which had already sparked a major revolt months earlier. Thousands of Cornishmen joined him as he was proclaimed king on Bodmin Moor, but as the royal army approached, Warbeck lost his nerve and abandoned his troops. Warbeck was eventually captured and imprisoned in the Tower of London. His end came in 1499 after a failed escape attempt involving the Earl of Warwick, the last legitimate male-line descendant of the House of York. On the 23rd of November 1499, Perkin Warbeck was hanged, and shortly thereafter, the Earl of Warwick was executed. With Warwick's death, the direct male line of the Plantagenet dynasty was finally extinct, leaving the Tudors as the undisputed masters of England. While the Wars of the Roses are often depicted as a period of relentless national chaos, many historians, including revisionists like K.B. McFarlane, suggest that their impact on the average person was actually quite limited. Large portions of the country, such as East Anglia, remained largely unaffected by the violence. Because both Yorkists and Lancastrians feared the economic ruin of the kingdom, they generally avoided destructive sieges and pillaging, preferring to settle their disputes through quick, decisive pitched battles. Even contemporary observers from the continent noted that England was unique because the consequences of war were mostly felt by the soldiers and nobles involved rather than by private citizens or their property. This era was defined by bastard feudalism, a shift in the medieval social structure that allowed wealthy landowners to maintain private armies of retainers. These lords often used the crown's instability to increase their own local power, accumulating wealth and influence at the expense of central authority. In many places, military defenses were neglected. Even in London, the citizens chose to negotiate with whichever army arrived at their gates rather than rebuild their crumbling walls. Over the entire 30-year span, there were actually fewer than 24 months of active campaigning, meaning that for most people, the wars were an intermittent nuisance rather than a constant struggle. The impact on the nobility was similarly complex. While it is a common myth that the English aristocracy was wiped out, records show that noble lines were extinguished by natural causes just as often as they were by the sword. However, the political landscape was undeniably altered. The power of preeminent families like the Nevilles was shattered, and the direct male line of the Plantagenet dynasty was eventually ended. Despite this, the royal bloodline survived. Every English monarch since then has been a direct descendant of Edward III through various female lines, a continuity broken only briefly by the rule of Oliver Cromwell centuries later. Ultimately, while the wars were largely a private feud between noble houses, they still carried a human cost, with an estimated 105,000 deaths, roughly 5.5% of the population. Remarkably, England's resilience was such that by 1490, the population had actually grown by more than 12% compared to when the conflict began. The Wars of the Roses did not destroy England. Instead, they cleared the way for the more centralized, absolute power of the Tudor monarchs who followed. While the Battle of Stoke Field ended the military phase of the conflict, the specter of the Plantagenets continued to haunt the early Tudor monarchs. When Henry VII first took the throne, there were no fewer than 18 other descendants of the Plantagenet line, who theoretically possessed a stronger blood claim than his own. By 1510, this number had nearly doubled as more Yorkist children were born. However, the true security of the dynasty was achieved through Henry VIII. As the grandson of the Yorkist King Edward IV, he embodied the union of both houses and held a superior title to any potential rival. The persistent Dalrymple family remained the most dangerous holdouts, but their ambitions were eventually crushed. Edmund Dalrymple was executed in 1513, and his brother Richard, the last White Rose pretender, fell in battle at Pavia in 1525. The ascension of the Tudors marked a fundamental shift in how England was governed. Henry VII inherited a weakened, faction-ridden administration and transformed it into a centralized new monarchy. Through frugal spending and a focus on stability, he left his successors a thriving economy and a kingdom that would not see another civil war for 155 years. While the Tudors significantly strengthened royal authority, they were careful to operate within established legal boundaries, choosing to cooperate with the nobility rather than rule in spite of them. It was during this era that the divine right of kings was popularized, a philosophical tool meant to reinforce the crown, though it would eventually lead to the downfall of the Stuart kings centuries later. The stability brought by the Tudors allowed the English Renaissance to flourish, ushering in a revolution in art, music, and literature. Perhaps the most significant legacy of the Wars of the Roses, however, was the English Reformation. Haunted by the memory of the succession crisis that had fueled the wars, Henry VIII became obsessed with securing a male heir. This drive to avoid a new civil war was the primary motivator behind his decision to break with the Roman Catholic Church and establish the Church of England. This era reached its peak under his daughter, Elizabeth I, whose golden age is remembered as a pinnacle of English cultural and political power. Historians often point out that the popular image of the Wars of the Roses as a time of unmitigated slaughter was a narrative carefully crafted by Tudor-era writers like William Shakespeare and Sir Thomas More. By portraying the Yorkist era and Richard III in particular as a dark age of tyranny and lawlessness, the Tudors were able to present their own regime as a period of enlightenment and peace. Whether or not this Tudor myth was exaggerated, it is undeniable that the nation emerged from the conflict more expansive and optimistic than it had been for centuries. In the medieval world, war was usually a slow game of shadows and stone. For centuries, military strategy had been defined by the siege, where massive castle walls protected the local people and nullified the terrifying power of heavy cavalry. Most generals avoided open, pitched battles because they were too risky. One bad afternoon could result in the total destruction of an army or the death of a king. However, the Wars of the Roses broke all these rules. The English nobility had no desire for long, grinding sieges that would burn their crops and ruin their valuable estates. Instead, they actively hunted one another down, seeking out quick, violent, and decisive confrontations in the open field to settle their blood feuds as fast as possible. As the fighting intensified, the ancient code of chivalry, the set of rules that once encouraged knights to capture and ransom one another for profit, began to wither away. The wars became personal and merciless. Edward IV was famous for commanding his troops to spare the commons but kill the lords. This strategy turned every battlefield into a political execution ground. If a noble couldn't escape the field, they were often executed on the spot to ensure their faction could never rise again. The way these men fought was also changing. Unlike the knights of old who charged on horseback, the English gentry now fought almost entirely on foot. The battlefield was a terrifying mix of masked longbowmen and infantry, wielding brutal, close-quarters weapons like poleaxes and bills. While the longbow had once been a super weapon, both sides now possessed it, and its power was being challenged by a new technological marvel: fluted plate armor. Thanks to the invention of the blast furnace, steel was becoming stronger and more affordable. A knight encased in a full suit of 15th century plate armor was a walking tank, yet surprisingly agile. His gear weighed only about 15 kilograms, 33 pounds, which is actually lighter than the equipment carried by a modern soldier. While the air hummed with arrows, the ground began to shake with the first sounds of gunpowder. Crude hand cannons and arquebuses made their appearance, and massive bombards, heavy siege cannons, proved that even the impregnable walls of castles like Bamberg could be shattered into dust. Though these early guns were expensive and prone to failure, they signaled the beginning of the end for the medieval way of life. The knights on the field at Bosworth or Towton were the last of their kind, fighting a war that was as much about the birth of a new era as it was about the death of an old one. The end of the 100 Years' War in France flooded England with thousands of experienced, unemployed soldiers. These men, skilled in the arts of death, but with no war to fight abroad, returned home to find a country drifting toward lawlessness. They soon found work in the private armies of powerful families like the Percys and the Nevilles, whose bitter local feuds were increasingly settled with blood rather than law. This era saw the rise of a system known as bastard feudalism, where the old ties of land and loyalty were replaced by cold, hard cash. Landowners began to bind knights and men-at-arms to their service through annual payments and legal contracts called indentures. This was a system originally perfected by Edward III to fight in France, where captains were hired to provide a specific number of archers and soldiers for a set price. In this new economy of war, a skilled longbowman could often command wages as high as a knight. Because these private retinues were loyal to the lords who paid them rather than to the king, the nobility suddenly possessed the military muscle that challenged the crown itself. Because the Wars of the Roses stretched across 32 years of sporadic violence, the leadership of these armies was in a constant state of flux. The great chain of command was frequently broken by sudden deaths in battle, cold-blooded executions, and the occasional shadowy assassination. Loyalty was also a moving target. Some of the most famous commanders, like Warwick the Kingmaker, famously switched sides when their personal ambitions were no longer being met. The conflict was fought between three main factions and a splinter group, the Lancastrians. the defenders of the status quo who fought to keep the crown on the head of Henry VI, and the descendants of John of Gaunt, the Yorkists. Those who believed the House of York held a superior blood, claim and sought to replace the Lancastrians with Edward IV or Richard III. The Yorkist rebels, a volatile group of Yorkists, who despite their hatred of Lancaster, grew to resent Edward IV so much that they turned against their own house. The Tudors, the final players who emerged from the wreckage in 1485, led by Henry VII to claim the throne by right of conquest and finally merge the warring factions. Thus the storm that had ravaged England for over 3 decades finally fell silent. The fields of Towton, Barnet, and Bosworth, once soaked in the blood of the finest nobility in Christendom, returned to the quiet labor of the plough. The crown, which had been bartered, stolen, and fought over in the mud, finally found a stable resting place on the head of a new kind of monarch. The Wars of the Roses were more than just a family feud. They were the dying gasps of the medieval world and the painful birth of modern England. From the ruins of the Plantagenets rose the Tudors, bringing with them a centralized power, a flourishing Renaissance, and a religious revolution that would change the world forever. The knights of old were gone, replaced by the diplomats and merchants of a new age. Yet the legends of their bravery and their betrayals still echo through the halls of history. And now, what do you think? Was the fall of the House of York an inevitable consequence of Richard III's ambition, or was it simply the result of a series of tragic accidents and betrayals on the battlefield? Was the Tudor victory a true salvation for England, or was it merely a masterclass in political propaganda? Write your opinions in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Thank you for watching.